Why my father never bought an expensive car again. Welcome to Money and Good Sense. Today, no complicated tax rules. I'd like to tell you a story. A story that changed my life. When I was about 10 years old, we went on vacation to Austria. Shortly before that, my father had bought his dream car, a Mercedes SEC. While we were having dinner, a man walked into the restaurant. You could see that he was looking for his wife. His wife saw him looking around, raised her hand and called out, "Honey, we're over here. Where have you been?" He replied, "Sorry, but there was such a beautiful Mercedes in the parking lot. I just had to look." My father heard that, smiled and proudly said, "That's mine." That started a conversation between them. A little later, they decided to go for a short drive together. I was allowed to come along. The drive. While we were driving, my father asked, "So, what do you do for a living?" The man replied, "I managed a portfolio." In Dutch, this can also mean a wallet, because the Dutch word is portefeuille. So my father assumed he meant wallet. The man laughed. He explained that he meant an investment portfolio. As an example, he said it contained about 0.1% of Heineken. My father looked at him and said very seriously, "Well, you have to start somewhere." Only later did he realize that 0.1% of such a large company could represent an enormous fortune. We actually laughed about this about 10 years later. When it became clear that the man was quite wealthy, my father asked the question almost everyone would ask. If you have so much money and you like this car so much, why don't you drive a Mercedes like this? The man looked at my father and said something I've never forgotten. "I can buy it 10 times over, but I cannot justify driving it." The explanation. Before he started doing the math, he explained why. He said he had 2 children. He didn't know what they would do later in life. Maybe one day they would have to work very hard for an average salary. Then he said something that always stayed with me. What kind of father would I be if I drove a beautiful car for 40 years? When I could have helped my children get started with a financial capital instead. Only then did he begin to explain what such a car really cost. Not just the purchase price, but also the depreciation, the maintenance, the insurance, and above all, the return that the same money could have generated if it had been invested. I will exchange the Dutch guldens at that time for dollars to make it a little more easier. Let's say the Mercedes in question cost about $100,000. That car loses about $5,000 in value every year. On top of that, there's insurance and maintenance cost, which will cost you about $1,000 more per year compared to a cheaper car. That means the car costs you roughly $6,000 extra every year. He compared that with an apartment. Suppose that apartment generates an average net return of 3% per year and also appreciates by an average of 2% annually. That means $3,000 in net rental income per year, $2,000 in annual appreciation. Together, that's about $5,000 in wealth growth every year. If you choose the car, it costs you $6,000 per year. If you choose the apartment, it earns you about $5,000 per year. The difference between those 2 choices in the first year is therefore about $11,000. That's more than $900 per month. And this is only about one car. If you buy another expensive car after a number of years, that loss essentially starts all over again. An apartment, on the other hand, keeps generating returns. And because of that, the difference can become enormous through compound growth. At the time, I didn't understand any of this as a child. Only years later did I realize that this conversation may well have been the most important financial lesson of my life. A simplified example to keep the calculation simple. I'll leave inflation and taxes out of the equation. In reality, they obviously play a role as well. But for understanding the principle of compound growth, they would only make the explanation unnecessarily complicated. Let's assume the following. We take a starting amount of $100,000. The apartment appreciates by an average of 2% per year. Net rental income, 3% per year. The net rental income is reinvested every year at 6% annual return. An expensive car costs an extra $6,000 per year, $5,000 in depreciation and $1,000 in additional maintenance and insurance cost. After 10 years, apartment value plus reinvested rent is about $162,000. The extra car cost $60,000. The difference is almost $222,000. After 20 years, the apartment value plus the reinvested rent is closing in to $260,000. The extra car cost $120,000. The difference now is almost $379,000. After 40 years, the apartment value plus the reinvested rent comes down to about $685,000. The extra car cost at $240,000. The difference after 40 years is closing in to $1 million. Again, this is a simplified example. Actual investment returns will, of course, vary, but it clearly shows how powerful compound growth can become over a long term. The impact. That conversation probably lasted no more than half an hour, but it changed my father's life. He never bought another expensive car after that, and without realizing it at the time, it eventually changed the way I looked at money as well. It was the first time I realized that things can be far more expensive in the long run than they appear at first glance. It was my first introduction to the power of compound growth. Not just what something costs today, but what a single financial decision can ultimately cost you over decades. Summary. Compound growth is perhaps one of the most powerful financial principles that exist. Unnecessary fixed expenses often seem harmless in the short term, but when that money is allowed to grow for many years, the difference can eventually become enormous. People often don't realize what something truly costs them over the long term. My perspective. As I see it, this is one of the events that influenced me the most. Normally, I prefer to keep personal stories to myself, but this was one story I really wanted to share. It took place in Tyrol, sometime during the winter of 1993 or 1994. If, by pure coincidence, the gentleman involved ever happens to see this, I would like to thank you. You probably never realized how much that one conversation influenced my father's life. Not only my father, but ultimately my own life as well. I'd be happy to buy you dinner someday. Thank you for watching, and as always, don't worry too much. Everything can be overcome with study and patience.